when we talk about the Spanish Empire, we need to understand that it is a global empire. Much like the Portuguese example, although, as you can tell, they controlled a much larger territory in the Americas, especially when we add in the North American portion of that empire. These areas you see in blue, the Spanish, to some extent, well, to a large extent, pushed the Portuguese out, but there's also a time when Portugal and Spain were united politically, and so that kind of does some funny things with the map. The other part I would draw your attention to is over here in the Philippines, where the Spanish had obviously an extensive colony, and they held on to it until 1898. Of all that empire, the colonies in the Americas were the most important, not just because of their size, although as you can tell, they were the most extensive colonies that the Spanish Empire possessed. It was also about the wealth that they extracted from them. And most famously, lots and lots of gold. And Columbus is the person who kind of opened the door to this colonization. And even though he arrived in the wrong spot, in the sense that he thought he had reached the Indies, and he had not, and so he thought he was in Asia, when really he was in this area in the Americas. But he was followed up by conquistadors in the 1500s. Thank you. And they were able to conquer this huge area. And there were several things that allowed them to do that. And the first one I put here at the outset so that we don't forget about it. It's easy to lose sight of the fact that the Spanish did not just come in and conquer or wipe out everybody. The number of conquistadors was always small. If for no other reason, then it's still very difficult to transport people across the Atlantic. So armies are going to be small. So they worked with native allies. We have different empires here. Those empires have conquered themselves, other peoples, sometimes outright, and included their territory in their empires. Sometimes they just oppressed them. And so there were allies that wanted to fight against the indigenous empires. The Spanish themselves also had superior technology, right? Especially in terms of military technology. Here we're talking about three things: firearms, steel, and horses. And I know that from that list, it looks like which one of these does not belong. And Sierra could reasonably say horses. Horses are animals, they're not technology. And Sierra, you'd be right. But we'll come back to why horses belong in that list. Bless you. All right, firearms are the military technology we're most likely to associate with Europeans when conquering non-Europeans. These firearms are not very good, really inaccurate, slow to load, pretty ineffective, but not useless. And they're also terrifying if you have not seen these before. And these would have been totally new to the indigenous people of the Americas. The Spanish also had steel, right? Steel weapons like swords, lances, but also steel armor. And that steel armor, especially, was excellent protection against the weapons that the indigenous Americans had. They had some metal, but in terms of their weapons, we're essentially talking about Stone Age weaponry. In many cases, it would be a heavy wooden club that had inlaid obsidian blades. Obsidian is volcanic glass, which is really sharp, and if you're not wearing armor, it can definitely lay open deep cuts. But if you are wearing steel armor, well, it is glass, right? And it's going to shatter against your steel armor. So the steel is also very important. And then in terms of horses, okay, so horses themselves aren't technology, but the saddles and stirrups that the conquistadors have to help them fight from horseback, that is technology. Even though you see a saddle, right, it makes you think of old-timey things like cowboys and the day before cars. But in its day, the saddle with stirrups was a major technological advantage over people who did not have it. And the natives also didn't have horses. In terms of large animals that they could use to do labor, really all they had would be like the llama or the alpaca. That's it. And you can't ride those. I suppose if you're very small, you could, but you wouldn't want to ride an alpaca into battle. And third, the other advantage the conquistadors had was disease. They brought with them all of those diseases that wiped out native populations. And importantly, the waves of diseases would move ahead of the conquistadors themselves. If the conquistadors come in and wipe out your village and Drew is somehow able to escape, right, and go warn other villages, there's a good chance that Drew is already infected with one or more of those diseases, takes it to the next village, infects them, and when the conquistadors finally do show up, they find a community where most of the people are dead or dying and the others are too weak to offer strong resistance. So those things really helped the Spanish. I know previously I said they toppled empires when they conquered territory. 3 empires we need to note. The Aztec in what is now south central Mexico and on down into southern Mexico. The Mayan, which includes Guatemala, El Salvador, Belize, Honduras. And then in South America, along the western side of the continent, right, from Ecuador down to Chile, we have the Incan Empire. Now, the conquistadors did destroy the empires, but what I also don't want you to forget is that the Aztec, Mayan, Incan people didn't just disappear. They continued to exist. Elements of their culture, their language continued to exist. Often they found kind of subtle ways to resist the Spanish. And so to this day, you will still find indigenous languages spoken. I know you have students, some of them are in your classes, whose first language, you might think it's Spanish, but really their first language is going to be some kind of Mayan language. You may hear them speaking Spanish, right, if you hear them speaking any other language except English, but realize for a lot of them, if you say something to them in English, they might translate it in their head first into Spanish and then from Spanish into their native language. And that's how persistent these languages have remained. So I don't want you to think that all of these people just disappeared, no matter how many of them were killed. The Spanish model of conquering also wasn't simply to move in and make some allies and wipe everybody else out. They took their same Reconquista strategy they'd used to take back the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslim Moors and applied it in the New World. So what that looks like, one, you try to make the local people you're conquering more like you. You impose your culture, including your language and also religion. You don't need to capitalize religion. That's just a typo. It's not going to hurt if you do. If you like consistency in your notes, it can perfectly be put as a lowercase. And we can tell that the Reconquista strategy was very effective because Spanish is the lingua franca for most of the Americas. You can go anywhere and speak Spanish and be understood. Although there are going to be some areas in places like Guatemala where if you get outside of the cities, their ability to communicate with you in Spanish is going to be much less. They may have been even more successful. Actually, I think it is fair to say they were more successful in spreading their religion, hence the centuries of domination religiously of the Roman Catholic Church. That's starting to break up a little bit. Actually, well, it's beginning to break up quite a lot, actually. But to the extent that people are leaving the Roman Catholic Church, they're just going to like evangelical Christian churches. Part of imposing Spanish culture and control is also living among the locals. Okay, so you don't just tell them what to do, check in on them every once in a while to make sure they're doing what you ask them to do. You are moving in and living with them. When this had been done in Spain, you would have Spanish families move in to an area, right, after the military has made it safe. That's not how things work in the Americas, because women are not coming along on these ships. And these are just unattached men moving across the Atlantic Ocean and living in the Americas. And this meant that they intermarried with native women, which produced the mestizo ethnicity, which just means a mix of European and indigenous ancestry. Which kind of set the stage for a racial or ethnic hierarchy in the Spanish colonies, where the only people who were really seen as worthy of being in charge were people whose parents were both European Spanish and had not been in a family in the Spanish colonies more than a generation. You really wanted to bring in like fresh European blood to run things. They just didn't trust the influence that might be affecting the Spanish who were in charge. For those Spanish who are in charge that are coming over to conquer the Americas, they maintain control through the encomienda system, which is going to look like a feudal system because it essentially is. Conquistador is given a piece of land. Just as in the medieval European situation, the land came with peasants. Here, the land comes with indigenous people that are essentially the slaves for the conquistador to use as he sees fit. Now, in theory, they are supposed to take care of their slaves, look out for their well-being, not mistreat them. But in reality, this is a brutal system that results in many more deaths among indigenous people added on top of the deaths from warfare and disease. Now, this image here to kind of show the encomienda system is deceptive. And we have images like this anytime a new European group comes to the Americas and try to get other people from their country to follow them. So in this case, it looks like the gold is really just, as soon as you break through the surface of a hillside, it's just full of gold. Right? Which you want to show that because, man, if Conquistador thinks you can just come over here and like start digging into the side of the hill and the gold rolls out, then that's like awesome. For one thing, even if it is this kind of mining, it's really hard work. It's really dangerous work. This looks a lot like any images. If you do a Google image search for a coltan mine in the Congo, right, it looks a lot like this kind of open pit mining, which is really hard, dirty, dangerous work. Sometimes those mining areas will collapse in and kill people. And much the same story here. And if you're wondering why in the world would anybody look up an image of coltan mining, you guys should probably care where coltan comes from because it's what makes your cell phones possible and your laptops possible. and it relies on the exploitation of a lot of people. I'll try and think of other things to cheer you up on a Monday. For now, you'll just have to get by with that news. So what got the Spanish into this game? Well, of course, making money is a good thing. Spreading Christianity to them was a good thing. But what initially really drives them is jealousy. This gets at the glory motive. Their little neighbors, Portugal, have built up this huge trading network. They've taken over the spice trade from the Muslims. And that's what they're particularly jealous of. They want that prestige, they want that money, and they don't know about the Americas. As I said, Columbus thought he found Asia. That's why we have those islands out there in the Caribbean that are still called the West Indies. Now, to give Columbus some credit, he wasn't the only person that was confused. The Portuguese were also convinced that Columbus had just found a backdoor into Asia. They had been sailing east to get to Asia, around Africa. It was this really long, dangerous journey, and it looked like Columbus just found a huge shortcut to Asia. And this kind of escalated pretty quickly and put Portugal and Spain kind of on the path to war. We have a rare instance where such a war is averted by mediation, and in this case it was done by the Pope. Now, the Pope's got a pretty good chance here. Spain and Portugal are both Catholic monarchies. They very much see themselves as linked to the church. As a result of that mediation, we get the Treaty of Tordesillas. Not the Treaty of Tortoises and not the Treaty of Tortillas, which I will still sometimes see written in notes. And what this treaty did is it carved up the New World. There was going to be a Spanish part and a Portuguese part, and each one would stick to their own area in the Americas. Now, they had to change this agreement over time. This initial map showing the treaty line leaves off a lot of this territory that Portugal claimed and was going to occupy. They also discovered that any line you draw on the Earth goes clear around the Earth, and so they had to make some adjustments. But it did work and kept the peace. Next up are the Dutch. That empire I introduced is kind of the one we would not think about. That seems really unlikely. And it was unlikely. The Dutch are not even a country until kind of well into the era of exploration. About 90 years after Columbus has done his first voyage. They become a country when they win their independence from Spain. And in less than 2 decades, they are a major sea power with about 20,000 ships. Now, I don't want you to have images that these are all warships. Some of them are. A lot of them are there just to conduct trade and make money. The other thing you should know about the Dutch is that their whole country exists as a never-ending battle against nature. The Netherlands, like Belgium, are called the Low Countries, because especially in the case of the Netherlands, much of their territory is below sea level. And the only thing that keeps it dry enough to live on and enough to farm is constant, massive pumping of water. And that's what their windmills are all about. And To create those windmills, they had to be early pioneers of effective taxing systems, right? Because you need a steady stream of money to maintain and staff those windmills. So given that they had to fight for their independence and had to fight to keep their country dry and livable, how in the world did they have time or energy or money to build an empire? Well, one thing is they focused their priorities. They left off the religious motive. They only focused on two G's, gold and glory. And really, when it comes right down to it, the Dutch then and now still mostly interested in making money. And that's not a knock against the Dutch. The Dutch are very good at doing trade and making money. As I also hinted at in the previous slide, they figured out how to do finance. Now, what I talked about there was taxes, and that is part of it. But they also figured out how the government could borrow money and how you could set up banks as a way of lending money. Because banks, right, and government borrowing allow you to essentially invent new money. And I'm not talking about this as a scam. But banks lend out a lot more money than they actually have in their bank vaults. That's how banks operate. That's not a scam. It's not necessarily a dangerous thing. As a matter of fact, most of the times it's not dangerous at all. It's what allows people to get loans to buy houses and start businesses. And in the Dutch case, to start companies and build ships. Same with government borrowing. Other European governments in this time period, and really for long after, often just ran out of money. This is something that happened to the English quite a bit. So kings would have to beg money, they would have to sell things, they would have to invent new taxes that made the people angry. And then even then, they'd still be broke. And the third thing the Dutch did was they kind of outsourced a lot of this work of empire building to companies. Specifically, the Dutch East and West Indies companies. Their empire looks different. You've been able to see this map for a while. Mostly we have relatively small areas. They don't go very far inland. Kind of their most extensive probably be here in what's now South Africa, and then especially Indonesia. Let's look at those companies. I know banking, taxes, borrowing doesn't sound exciting, but the Dutch companies, they're kind of like, of their day, they're the Wagner Group on steroids. If you don't know who the Wagner Group is, that's like kind of the private mercenary army that Russia has been using to fight some of the most dangerous places in Ukraine where the Russian army wasn't winning. It also uses the Wagner Group as a way to overthrow unfriendly governments in Africa and protect friendly governments in Africa. And the Dutch companies, kind of the same thing, but even more powerful. They were created specifically to run the Dutch trade in what everybody thought was Asia. And to do this, they were given the power to make their own legitimate money, which used to be much more impressive to students before Bitcoin and Ethereum and all these other cryptocurrencies came around. But you should know that to this point, that cryptocurrencies are essentially just like a speculative investment where you can throw your money into it, and you might get rich, or you might be like a lot of people towards the tail end of the pandemic who lost tens of thousands of dollars. They really didn't have to spare. And cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are still pretty hard to spend. In this case, though, this was coins, right? Regular physical money, cash, that the companies were authorized to create. And that's a big deal, because it turns out like Jaden can't go out and start a company and be like, you know what, I am going to make my own money. I will pay my employees in this money. I will buy and sell things in this money. And like, I just won't use dollars except when I really want to. Well, you can't do that, right? Jaden would get in big trouble for pulling something like that. But the Dutch companies were allowed to. They were also allowed to make their own treaties. Treaties are important legal agreements, usually made only between countries. Right? One country makes them with a foreign government. In this case, the company was allowed to make legally binding agreements with foreign peoples and foreign governments. It would be like if Walmart cut a deal with Chinese companies that produce things that sold in its store, and you said, you know what, you just import these things right directly to Walmart's port facilities in Los Angeles, and you won't have to pay the United States government any taxes on that stuff. We're going to make that deal with you. Walmart could not do that, but the Dutch companies could. And if I have any chance of interesting you in these Dutch companies, this is probably it. They were allowed to create their own private militaries. And we have instances of these companies fighting other companies with navies and armies halfway across the world to settle disputes. And these companies helped force the Portuguese out of the Asian trade. She is actually with Mrs. Schweitzer. I can't remember what room number that is.
Do you know where the theater is? Yeah. There's that little entrance area. 104. Yeah, 104.
Thank you. Sorry. And after forcing out the Portuguese, they were able to dominate trade in the Indian Ocean. Just to go back to it, the Indian Ocean is this area, which is tremendously important because a lot of that trade and all those little orange dots that represent trading settlements, they're all around the Indian Ocean. Right? And even the stuff that's over here to get back to Europe right now has to go back through the Indian Ocean. So if the Dutch can control that, they've set themselves up to be very powerful and very rich. And they are also part of the story of colonization in the Americas. They colonized a little bit. You can see it on the map of North America. They called it New Netherlands. The Europeans were typically not terribly creative in coming up with new names for the places they conquered. It was an area that had been explored by a man named Hudson. You'll learn more about him later. Their colony was in the modern northeastern part of our country. A lot of it was focused on Long Island and New York City, which they called New Amsterdam. I don't know why there's the random bullet point there. And I told you before they were really focused on gold and glory, but foremost on gold. And again, not actual gold. For them, the money was in animal furs. Which, if that sounds kind of like a bummer, no, there was tremendous money in animal furs. They used them for all kinds of things, and the furs remained incredibly valuable into kind of the first half of the 1800s. And a lot of what they were after, you were wondering why this was their image, beaver pelts. Take that and turn them into felt and then make hats. And if you look up like a Stetson beaver felt hat, I think there's still like several $100s for a hat made out of that. So valuable then, valuable now. The problem is, even though they made a lot of money, there weren't a whole lot of Dutch who wanted to come over here to live. And at first, that's not a huge problem. Where we're going to see that become a problem is when other European countries get interested. If other European countries are interested in your territory and you haven't brought in a lot of settlers, you're in trouble. And where the Dutch will get into trouble is with the English. Even though the story of the English is a lot like the Dutch. And it's not an accident. The Dutch or the English are in all kinds of trouble. They have their own civil war. When they finally kind of get things sorted out, they bring in a Dutch monarch, William of Orange, to be the new monarch of England. With a Dutch monarch comes lots of Dutch ideas that the English are very eager to put in place. They have a lot of catching up to do, like the Dutch. They were late to the game of exploring and empire building. They also were in the position of having to beat Spain. And this is where we get another instance of something kind of circling back to us from another topic we covered. We talked about religious conflict in the lead up to the 30 Years' War. We talked about the Spanish Armada and the Spanish attempt to invade England by sea. That's happening in the middle of all this. In 1581, the Dutch get their independence from Spain. In 1588, the English defeat the Spanish Armada. The English also create a company to do a lot of their exploring and empire building. And their East India Company would also be able to do a lot of the things that the Dutch companies could do, including building a military. The English also built up a fleet, which of course they're going to have to do if the British are someday going to have the most powerful navy in the world and maintain that for a couple of centuries. Actually, more than a couple of centuries. They also helped to push the Portuguese out of Asia. The Dutch aren't doing all of this on their own. And again, like the Dutch, they also built colonies in North America. What's different than the Dutch? One important thing is the focus of where they're doing their empire building. And in Asia, they focused on specifically India, the same territory that is now the country of India. Part of this is because the Dutch were much stronger everywhere else. Now, before we go to exit slip, we will talk a little bit about English colonization in North America. The starting point is Jamestown, Virginia. And this is the story that is very inaccurately told in the Disney cartoon Pocahontas. Jamestown set up in 1606. And to keep things in perspective for time, remember, Columbus makes his first voyage in 1492. So the English really are late. But they hoped to find gold like the Spanish had. And I mean, they were obsessed with finding gold to the point that they didn't do enough to plant crops so that they could have a harvest and food to last them through the North American winter. As a result, they had a lot of starvation and a lot of disease.
Is there another way that you can find how I can raise my grade up, because most of the assignments on Canvas are not working?
Okay, I'll talk with Miss Schweitzer and try and figure out. And along with starvation goes its close friend, disease. They also got into fights with the natives. And because the English were not strong and the natives were more numerous, it really wasn't that successful. And so by 1610, about 9 out of every 10 settlers has died. And on that happy note, we will stop our notes for today. You need to go back to Canvas. I'll leave that up there. Your exit slip is short. It's a little different than usual because it's not going to lock until exactly at 11 so that you have the full 3 minutes. Covers the same pages and notes as the Do Now. If you're having trouble finding it, let me know. But again, I want to leave those notes up so that people can get anything that they missed on that last slide.